The day Edith Gentry learned that a stranger had bought her dead husband's debt was the same day she saddled her horse at dawn, knotted her dark hair beneath her hat, and rode 12 miles across the Texas hill country with enough fury in her chest to set the whole prairie on fire. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Carver's Creek sat baking in the early heat like a clay pot left too close to the hearth. The war had been over for 13 years, but its shadow still moved through the land in the faces of men who came back wrong, in the widows who had to keep breathing when breathing felt like a punishment, and in the ledgers of the Carver's Creek lending house where names like Edith Gentry were written in red ink beside numbers that seemed to grow larger no matter how many hours she worked. Edith was 29 years old, and she had the kind of face that made people look twice, not because it was delicate or soft, but because it held something fierce and unresolved, like a sky that could not decide between a storm and a clearing. She had wide brown eyes that missed nothing, a straight jaw that she set hard when she was thinking, and hands that were rougher than they had any right to be on a woman who had once been the daughter of a schoolteacher in the hill country outside of Austin. Her husband, Clarence Gentry, had died 2 winters past of a fever that swept through the county, the way wildfires swept through dry grass fast, indiscriminate, and without any care for the people left behind. He had not been a bad man, Clarence. He had simply been unlucky. He had borrowed $500 from the Carver's Creek lending house to buy seed and equipment for the small farm they had scratched out of a rocky hillside, and when the drought hit the summer before his death, the crop had failed entirely. The debt had accumulated interest. Then Clarence had died, and the interest kept accumulating whether or not there was anyone left to earn against it. Edith had spent 2 years trying to pay it back. She took in mending. She sold eggs and butter at the Saturday market. She taught reading to the children of families who could not afford the schoolhouse fees. She had reduced the debt from $530 to just under $400, which felt like trying to empty a river with a teacup. Every month, she walked into the lending house and handed over what she could to a pale, humorless man named Dillard, who recorded her payment in his ledger with the expression of a man who already knew the ending to the story. What Edith did not know, what no one had told her, was that 3 weeks earlier, a man named Gilbert Hadley had walked into the lending house on a Wednesday morning, placed $410 in cash on Dillard's desk, and purchased her debt in full. She found out on a Thursday morning in April when she walked in with her monthly payment of $12.60 wrapped in a cloth, and Dillard looked up from his ledger with something in his eyes that she could not immediately name. "Mrs. Gentry," he said, in that dry, papery voice of his, "your debt has been satisfied." She stood in the doorway and let the dust from the street settle around her boots. "I beg your pardon." Dillard turned the ledger around so she could see the entry. The red ink that had carried her name for 2 years had been crossed through with a single black line, and beside it someone had written, "Purchased and settled. G. Hadley, March 28, 1878. The world went very still for a moment, then it started moving too fast. "Who is G. Hadley?" she asked. "Gilbert Hadley," Dillard said. "Rancher, runs the Rocking H about 12 miles south toward the river. Good land. He came in 3 weeks ago, paid the full remaining balance and took the note." "He took the note," Edith repeated. "He owns it now, technically. You'd owe the money to him." "And nobody thought to tell me." Dillard had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "Mr. Hadley asked that it be handled quietly. He said he didn't want you to feel what?" Her voice was quiet, which was the most dangerous version of her voice. People who knew Edith Gentry knew that she went soft before she went explosive, the way the air goes still before a tornado. "I believe he said he didn't want you to feel embarrassed," Dillard finished. Edith took her $12.60 off the counter, folded the cloth neatly, and placed it back in her coat pocket. She thanked Dillard in a voice that was extremely polite and extremely controlled. Then she walked outside into the April sunlight, stood beside her horse for approximately 30 seconds, and made a decision. She rode home, changed into her riding clothes, the practical ones, the ones she wore when she was doing real work, braided her hair tightly, and saddled her mare, a dark bay named Josephine who could feel her moods as clearly as any person could. She rode south out of Carver's Creek at a steady canter, following the road that cut through the mesquite and cedar toward the river country. The rocking H Ranch came into view around mid-morning, and even through the shimmering heat and her considerable anger, Edith noticed that it was a well-kept place. The fencing was solid, the barn was painted a dark red that still held its color, and the main house was a substantial two-story structure with a wide front porch and a live oak so large beside it that its shade covered half the yard. Cattle moved in the distant pastures, heavy with spring grass, and the windmill near the water tank turned slowly in the morning breeze. She rode through the gate without slowing, and the ranch hand who was splitting wood near the barn looked up with wide eyes as she passed. A dog came bounding off the porch, tail going like a flag in a windstorm, but she barely registered it. A man came out of the barn just as she was pulling Josephine to a stop in the yard, and she knew immediately that this was Gilbert Hadley. He was taller than she'd expected from a man who apparently conducted his business so quietly, with broad shoulders and a rancher's build that spoke of years of physical work. He had dark hair that was slightly too long, sun-browned skin, and eyes of an unusual amber-green color that caught the morning light in a way she found immediately irritating because she had come here to be angry, and she did not want to be distracted. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with the kind of face that was not exactly handsome in the classical sense, but was honest and well-shaped, with a strong jaw and a mouth that looked like it might smile easily if it were given the opportunity. He was not giving it that opportunity right now. He was looking at her with an expression that suggested he had been expecting this visit, which irritated her even further. "Mr. Hadley," she said, from the back of her horse. "Mrs. Gentry," he said in a voice that was low and unhurried. He did not look alarmed. He did not back up. He just stood there with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his amber-green eyes taking her in with the careful attention of a man who is used to reading weather. "You bought my debt," she said. "I did," he agreed. "Without telling me. Yes. Without asking me. Also yes." She had prepared a great many things to say on the 12-mile ride, and now they were all crowding up behind her teeth at once, jostling each other. She chose the most important one. "Who gave you the right?" she demanded, and her voice had gone back to that quiet, precise tone that anyone who knew her would have recognized as the storm arriving. Gilbert Hadley did not flinch. He looked up at her for a moment, just looked, with those strange amber-green eyes, and then he said simply, "Nobody. It wasn't about right. It was about not being able to stand watching a woman work herself to the bone over Clarence Gentry's bad luck when the fixing was something I could do." She had not expected that. She had expected excuses or deflection or condescension. She had not expected simple honesty. "I don't need fixing," she said. "No," he said, "you don't. I know that. Nobody who's done what you've done for 2 years needs fixing, but the situation needed it. The situation was mine to handle." "It was," he agreed again, "and you were handling it fine. You'd have paid it off in another 3 or 4 years. I didn't want to watch you do that." She climbed down from Josephine then, because she felt ridiculous having this conversation from the height of a horse, and because her legs needed the ground under them. She tied Josephine to the porch railing with a sharp motion and turned to face him fully. He was taller than she'd thought, standing this close. He smelled of hay and cedar and the particular clean scent of morning work. She pushed that observation aside. "You said you didn't want to watch me do that," she said. "That implies you have been watching me." Something shifted in his expression, not embarrassment exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of reluctant candor. "I live 12 miles away," he said. "I come into town every couple of weeks for supplies. I'm not a man who gossips, Mrs. Gentry, but in a small town you hear things whether you want to or not. And what I heard for 2 years was a woman doing everything right against everything wrong." He paused. "I knew Clarence some, not well. He bought feed from a man I know." He didn't deserve what happened to him, and neither did you. So you bought my debt out of pity, she said, and her chin came up. No, he said, and there was a firmness in it that stopped her. Not pity. I don't have a great deal of patience for pity. It's a useless emotion. I bought it because I wanted to, and because I had the money to, and because— He stopped himself. Then he started again, more carefully. Because it seemed to me that some things in this world can be made easier without anybody being diminished by it if the person doing the making easier is sensible about how they go about it. You were not sensible, she said. You were secretive. You're right, he said. That was a mistake. I should have come to you directly. I thought it might feel like an insult, coming directly. I thought Dillard telling you after the fact would feel softer. I was wrong about that. She had been braced for him to defend himself more forcefully, and the admission of being wrong landed differently than she'd anticipated. It was difficult to stay at the same temperature of fury when someone was being straightforwardly honest with you. What do you want from me? She asked. For the money? Nothing, he said. That is not a reasonable answer. I know it isn't, he said, but it's the true one. I don't want anything from you. The debt is settled. You don't owe me anything. She stared at him for a long moment. Behind her, Josephine shifted her weight and let out a breath through her nose. You paid $410, Edith said. Give or take. That is a great deal of money to spend on nothing. I've spent money on worse things, he said, and for the first time the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. She did not want to find him likable. She had ridden here to be angry, and she was still angry, but it was becoming a different kind of anger, the kind that is mostly about pride and the humiliation of helplessness, which was a feeling she knew very well and did not enjoy. It was not the same as anger at this particular man who was standing in front of her being straightforward and calm and infuriatingly reasonable. I'm going to pay you back, she said. You don't have to. I didn't ask if I had to. I'm going to. He looked at her for a moment with those amber eyes, and something in them was thoughtful and warm. All right, he said. If that's what you need to do, it is. A silence settled between them, but it was not an uncomfortable one. From somewhere inside the barn came the sound of a horse moving, and in the live oak a mockingbird started cycling through its borrowed songs. The morning had grown warm. Would you like some coffee? Gilbert asked. You rode a long way. She almost said no. Then she thought about the 12 miles she had to ride back, and the fact that she had not eaten breakfast because she had left in too much of a hurry, and she said, All right. The kitchen of the Rocking H was large and well-ordered, which surprised her. She had expected the bachelor disorder of a man living alone, and instead found a clean-scrubbed table, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and a cast-iron stove that was clearly well cared for. A black cat was asleep on a chair near the window and opened one eye to assess her, found her acceptable, and went back to sleep. Gilbert poured coffee into 2 heavy mugs and set one in front of her without asking how she took it. She took it plain, which was how he appeared to take his as well. They sat at opposite ends of the table and drank their coffee, and Edith looked around the kitchen because looking at him felt like a choice she wasn't ready to make. You live here alone? She asked. I do. I have 3 ranch hands, Tomas, Eddie, and a young fellow named Cobb who's been with me about a year. They've got a bunkhouse out back, but just me in the house. How long have you had the ranch? 8 years. Bought the land in 1870 and spent 3 years getting it to where it's something worth having. He wrapped both hands around his mug. It's good land, good water from the river. The cattle do well here. She nodded. She was beginning to feel the 12-mile ride in her back, and the coffee was very good, dark and strong and not oversweetened. I'm going to set up a payment arrangement, she said, bringing them back to the matter at hand. I can pay $10 a month. It'll take several years, but I'll pay you the whole amount. Mrs. Gentry, $10 a month, she said. Those are my terms. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was caught between amusement and respect. You rode 12 miles to tell me your terms. I rode 12 miles because I was angry, she said. I'm still angry. I have a right to be angry. You do, he said. But I'm also— She stopped. Started again. I'm also aware that you meant well, even if you went about it badly. I did mean well, he said quietly. That's the honest truth of it. She believed him. That was perhaps the most disorienting thing about the whole morning, that she had ridden here in a righteous fury and had found, instead of a man she could sustain that fury against, a man who was simply honest and earnest and clearly a little uncertain about whether he had done the right thing, even as he'd done it. $10 a month, she said again, starting in May. If that's what you need, he said, then that's what we'll do. She finished her coffee. She stood. She thanked him for it because she had manners even when she was irritated. He walked her out to the porch, and she untied Josephine and swung up into the saddle with the practiced ease of a woman who had been riding since before she could walk. She was about to turn the horse when he said, "Mrs. Gentry." She looked back. "I'm sorry I didn't come to you first," he said. "I should have. I'll do better if there's ever a next time." She looked at him for a moment in the warm April morning light, standing on his porch with his coffee mug still in his hand and the live oak spreading its shade behind him, and she thought that this was a very strange day and that she was not sure what to make of it or him. "See that you do," she said, and turned Josephine toward home. She was halfway up the road before she realized she was no longer angry. She was something else, something she didn't have a name for yet, and that, somehow, felt more significant than the anger had been. She came back on the 1st of May with her $10. She had dressed practically, she told herself. There was no reason to have taken any particular care with her appearance, except that she was calling on a man she had last seen when she was in the middle of an argument. And there was a dignity to looking composed when you had previously arrived at someone's property at a near gallop with fire in your eyes. That was why she had worn the dark blue dress with the white collar and put her hair up properly instead of simply braiding it back. Gilbert Hadley was on the porch when she rode up, and she could tell from the way he stood that he had been watching the road, which she noticed and filed away without comment. He had shaved, which she also noticed. She handed him the $10. He wrote her a receipt that she had not asked for but appreciated, and then they stood on the porch for a moment in the afternoon light, and she said, somewhat to her own surprise, "How are the cattle doing in the spring pasture?" His face opened up with genuine pleasure. "Better than I expected. I brought in a new bull last fall, Durham cross, and the first calves are coming in strong." He paused. "Would you want to see?" She had nowhere she urgently needed to be. "All right," she said. They walked together out to the spring pasture, and she learned that Gilbert Hadley was a different person when he was talking about something he loved. He became less careful and more alive, gesturing at the rolling grassland and the new calves on unsteady legs with the expansive enthusiasm of a man who had built something from nothing and still could not quite believe the fullness of it. He knew every animal by mark and temperament, knew which cow had a tendency to wander toward the east fence, knew that the big roan steer he called Congressman had an attitude problem but was worth keeping. She laughed at Congressman. It was the first time she had laughed in. She could not immediately say how long, and she felt it move through her like a window opening in a room that had been shut up for a long time. Gilbert looked at her when she laughed, and what was on his face was something unguarded and bright. They walked back to the house through the long afternoon light, and he asked her if she would stay for supper. She said she should be getting back. He nodded, said of course, and she rode the 12 miles home thinking about the pasture and the calves and the way a laugh felt after it had been away a long time. She came back in June with her $10. This time he had coffee ready when she arrived, as if he had been expecting her at a particular hour, and she realized she had come at the same time of day as before and that he had noticed. She stayed for 2 hours. They talked about the drought of 1877 and what it had done to the cattle prices, and about a new water diversion project that was supposed to help the smaller farms north of town, and about a book she had been reading, a novel by George Eliot that she had borrowed from the schoolteacher's wife. And when she mentioned the book, he said, quietly, that he had read it too, and that had surprised her so much she had looked at him directly in a way she had been careful not to do. "You read George Eliot?" She said, "My mother sent it to me last winter," he said, with a slight smile. "She sends me books regularly. She thinks I am going to go feral out here without enough literature. Is she right?" "She is not entirely wrong," he admitted. His mother's name was Ruth, she learned. Ruth Hadley, who lived in San Antonio with Gilbert's younger sister Clara, who had married a dentist and had 3 children and apparently wrote letters with great frequency and detail. His father had died when Gilbert was 16, and he had worked a cattle drive from Texas to Kansas at 17 to earn enough money to help his mother keep the house. He did not say this to make himself sound heroic. He said it as simply as he said everything, as though it was just the way things had been. She told him about her father, the school teacher, who had died when she was 20 and left her the small stone house outside Austin where she had grown up. She had sold it to pay for her own move to Carver's Creek, to the farm she and Clarence had been building. The stone house was somebody else's now, belonged to a young couple from Tennessee who were probably putting their own marks on the walls by this point. "Do you miss it?" he asked. She thought about the question honestly. "I miss what it represented," she said. "I miss my father. The house itself is just walls." "I understand that," he said. He turned his coffee mug on the table in a slow circle. "I don't have much that's from before. After my father died, things changed so much that the before feels like a different story." "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right, a different story." They looked at each other across the table, and the look lasted a beat longer than necessary, and then they both found something else to look at, and she thought, "This is going to become a problem for me." She came back in July. By August, she was staying for supper. She did not examine what she was doing too closely, because examining it closely would require her to name it, and naming it would require her to decide something. She had made great decisions very quickly once before, with Clarence, and he had been a good man and she had been fond of him truly. But she had been 22 and afraid of being alone, and she had not known, at 22, what it was to be known by someone. She had not known what it would feel like to sit across a table from a man and have him listen to what she said with the attentiveness of a person who found her genuinely interesting, not as an object of charity or pity or desire, but as a person worth listening to. Gilbert listened to her the way she imagined her father would have listened to her if she had been able to have more conversations with him as an adult. Not the same as her father. There was nothing fatherly about the way Gilbert looked at her, which she was also aware of and not examining closely, but with the same quality of careful, respectful attention. She came in September to find that something was wrong. She knew it before she had even tied Josephine to the railing, because the ranch had a different feeling to it, a tautness, an agitation in the air. One of the hands, Eddie, was outside the barn looking grim, and the other 2 were nowhere visible. Gilbert came out of the house as she dismounted, and he looked tired in a way that was deeper than physical. "What happened?" she asked. He told her without preamble. 2 nights ago, someone had cut the fence on the east pasture and driven off 43 head of cattle. The sheriff had come out and looked at the tracks and said he would investigate, which in Edith's experience meant he would do very little. 43 cattle was a significant loss, not ruinous, because Gilbert's operation was solid, but it was money, and it was a violation of something, the kind of casual cruelty of men who took things because they could. "Do you know who did it?" she asked. "I have a good idea," he said. He named a man, Denton Price, who had been running cattle north of the river and had been in a long-running dispute with Gilbert over water rights. She had heard the name. Most people in the county had. "Have you talked to a lawyer?" she asked. "I've written to one in Austin," he said. "The water rights issue it's complicated. Price has a claim, but it's not as strong as he thinks it is. The cattle," he shook his head. "Without proof, there's nothing legal I can do." She sat down on the porch steps without being invited, and he sat down beside her, and they talked about it for a long time. Not just the cattle, but the larger situation, the way men like Price operated in territories where the law was thin and slow, and the particular loneliness of being someone who tried to do things the right way when the right way was the harder way. She found herself touching his arm at one point, a brief, firm touch, the kind you give to someone when you want them to know you are with them, and she felt him go still for a moment before he exhaled and continued speaking. She stayed late that evening. Tomás, the senior ranch hand, a quiet Mexican man with a deeply creased face and the steady competence of someone who had been doing this kind of work his whole life, served supper with the air of a man who was very deliberately not commenting on any of the evening's arrangements. She liked Tomás immediately. When she finally left, riding home in the dark that she knew the road well enough to navigate safely, she was aware that something had shifted. The fence between them, the careful, polite, maintained distance had moved. She was not sure she was sorry. October brought a resolution to the Denton Price situation that was neither clean nor entirely satisfying, which was how most real resolutions in the hill country went. The lawyer from Austin found a 10-year-old survey that significantly undermined Price's water rights claim, and Price, faced with the cost of a real legal fight, backed down quietly and without apology, the way cowardly men always did. The cattle were never recovered. Gilbert absorbed the loss and moved forward because that was what you did. On the day she came in October, he met her at the gate on horseback, which was new. "I want to show you something," he said. "Do you have time?" She had made time. She had, if she was being honest with herself, been looking forward to Fridays. She had begun coming on Fridays specifically, because the week felt better with a Friday to look forward to since approximately July. He rode her to the eastern edge of his property, where the land rolled down toward the river, and the cypress trees made a corridor of dappled shade along the bank. The morning light came through the cypress in long, soft columns, and the river ran clear over its limestone bed with the sound of something perpetually calm. "I don't bring many people out here," he said. "Why are you bringing me?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that was very clear and very direct, the way he was when he was saying something he had decided to say honestly. "Because you're the person I most want to show it to," he said. They looked at each other for a moment with the river sounding between the cypresses and the light moving overhead. She said, "Gilbert," he said, "I know. I am not entirely sure what I want," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that." "You are the most honest person I have met," he said, "and I would not want you to be anything other than that." "I have been making payments to you for 6 months," she said, "and I have stayed for coffee and supper and walked your pastures and sat on your porch for considerable time," he agreed softly, "and I don't know what to call any of it. I don't think it needs a name yet," he said. "I think it just needs to keep being what it is." She looked at the river for a moment. Then she said, "When I rode here in April with fire in my eyes, I was absolutely certain I was going to say my piece and ride home and never think about this place again." "I remember," he said. "I was wrong about that." He smiled, and it was the full version of it this time, the real one, the one that she had been seeing the possibility of for 6 months, and it was exactly as warm as she had suspected it would be. "I'm glad you were wrong," he said. She was glad too. She just didn't say it yet. November was cold and sharp-edged, and the pecan trees along the road to the rocking H had gone gold and then bare, and the sky had that particular winter quality of being very far away and very blue. She came on Fridays still, and she came on some Tuesdays too now, which she told herself was because the road was easier before the expected midweek rains. On a Tuesday in mid-November, she arrived to find a woman on the porch with Gilbert, a handsome woman of about 50 with his coloring and his way of standing, who turned and looked at Edith with amber-green eyes that were so much like his that she knew immediately. "Mrs. Gentry," Gilbert said, coming down the porch steps quickly. "I'm sorry I didn't write to tell you my mother arrived 2 days ago." Ruth Hadley came down the steps herself, because she was clearly not a woman who waited on porch steps when there were people to meet, and took Edith's hands in both of hers with the directness of someone who had been waiting for this introduction. "I have been hoping to meet you for a very long time," Ruth said. "He's talked about me," Edith said, glancing at Gilbert. "He writes letters," Ruth said, with the air of a woman who has been reading between her son's careful lines for months. "He thinks he is subtle. He is not subtle at all. Gilbert had the expression of a man who had resigned himself to a certain quantity of embarrassment. They had lunched together at the big kitchen table, and Edith found Ruth Hadley to be one of the most immediately likable people she had encountered, direct, intelligent, curious, with a sense of humor that was dry and well-timed, and clearly the source of the version Gilbert kept buttoned up most of the time. Ruth asked her about her teaching, her farm, her reading, the Texas Hill Country, and the state of women's property rights in the state of Texas, on which she had strong opinions. She asked about Clarence, gently but without false delicacy, which Edith appreciated more than she could say. Most people avoided the subject entirely, as if saying Clarence's name would break something. "He sounds like he was a good man in hard circumstances," Ruth said. "He was," Edith said. "I was fond of him, I grieved him honestly, it's been 3 years now." Ruth nodded with the understanding of a woman who had done her own grieving. "Life has to keep going," she said, "even when it feels disloyal to let it." Edith looked at her and felt something ease. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." Gilbert was quiet during this exchange, but she felt him watching her, and when their eyes met across the table, there was a new thing in his expression, a relief, perhaps, and a gratitude, and something else that was warmer than either. Ruth stayed for 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks she managed, with great skill and very little apparent effort, to ensure that Edith and Gilbert spent a great deal of time together. She sent them to town together for supplies. She asked Edith to stay for supper 3 times. She was an excellent and completely unsubtle matchmaker, and by the end of her visit, Edith had stopped pretending to herself that she was coming to the Rocking H to make debt payments. Ruth left on a clear December morning, and when she hugged Edith on the porch, she held on for a moment longer than necessary and said, very quietly, "He needs someone who sees him. You do. Don't let pride be the last thing between you." Edith stood on the porch after Ruth's wagon had disappeared down the road, and then she looked at Gilbert, who had been standing beside her, and she said, "Your mother is remarkable. She is an absolute force of nature," he said. She turned to face him fully in the December morning cold. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him and the particular way he had of being very still when he was waiting for something important. "Pride is not the last thing between us," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "What is the last thing between us?" he asked very quietly. She thought about it honestly. "Fear, maybe," she said. "Of starting something again that I might lose again." He nodded slowly. His hand moved just a small movement toward her and then stopped. "I understand that," he said. "I have some of the same fear. He stopped, tried again. "I built this place by myself, Edith. The land, the house, the cattle, everything. I've built it from nothing, and I am proud of it, and I am also very aware that I come home every evening to a house that is quiet in the wrong way." She looked at him. "In the wrong way," she said. "In the way that means something is missing," he said. She reached out and took his hand, the one that had moved toward her, and stopped, and she held it, and they stood that way for a moment in the cold morning air. "Let's not be afraid," she said. "All right," he said, and he turned his hand in hers and held it back. He came to Carver's Creek 3 days later and called on her at the small house she rented on the north side of town, the first time he had ever come to her rather than the other way around. He brought a basket from Ruth, preserved peaches, and a wheel of hard cheese, and a note that said simply, "About time." He did not get down on one knee, which was not his way. He sat at her kitchen table the way he had sat at his own 100 times now, and he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I think you know that I would. But I want to be sure that you know what you're deciding, that it's this ranch and this life, and a man who is not always easy but will always be honest with you." She looked at him across her kitchen table and thought about her father's house and Clarence's farm, and the debt she had been paying down for 2 years, and the morning she had ridden to the Rocking H with fire in her eyes, and she thought about the river with the cypress trees and Ruth's parting words, and the way he had listened to her for 8 months like she was someone worth listening to. "I know what I'm deciding," she said. "Yes." They were married in March of 1879, almost exactly 1 year after he had walked into the lending house and put $410 on Dillard's desk. The wedding was small, the preacher from Carver's Creek Methodist, Ruth, who had come back from San Antonio with Clara and Clara's husband, and the 3 children, Tamaz and Eddie and young Cobb from the ranch, and a handful of people from town who had come to consider Edith a friend. Edith wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself, and she carried a handful of flowering cedar branches because it was March and they were what was in bloom. She had sold the small rented house in town and moved her few good possessions out to the rocking H in a single wagon load: her books, her father's reading chair, a quilt her mother had made, her tools, her kitchen things. Gilbert had cleared space in the house for everything before she arrived, making room without being asked, and she had understood that as a deliberate and important thing. When she walked through the door of the house with her father's reading chair, he was standing in the front room, and she placed the chair in the corner by the window where the light was good, and he said, "That's exactly right. That's where it should be." She looked at him. "This is going to be a real partnership," she said. "I won't be an ornament." "I would be in significant trouble if you were," he said, and she laughed. She laughed more in those first months of marriage than she had in the previous 3 years combined. She did not examine this too closely either, but she noticed it, the way you notice a change in the quality of the air, the way you breathe differently when something heavy you had been carrying is no longer there. The work was real and physical and demanding, and she was good at it. She had always been good at hard work. The problem before had been that she was working against the tide, and now she was working with it, with someone beside her who was pulling in the same direction. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the calving season in late winter, the branding in spring, the long days of summer haying, the fall cattle drives to the railhead at the nearest market town. She kept the accounts with a precision that made Gilbert tell her she was better with numbers than any person he had ever known, and she said, tartly, that she had learned numbers the way most people learned them, through needing them desperately. She still taught reading 2 days a week in Carver's Creek to children whose families could not afford the schoolhouse. She rode Josephine to town and rode back, and Gilbert never once suggested that this was time she should be spending on the ranch, because he understood without being told that this was not something she did for money but something she did because it was part of who she was. In the second summer of their marriage, there was a drought again, not as severe as 1877 but bad enough, the grass going sparse and yellow by July, the river dropping in its banks. The tension that moved through the ranching community during dry summers was particular and collective, the way everyone watched the sky and made quiet calculations about what they could afford to lose. Gilbert was steady through it, the way he was through most things, not without worry. She could see the worry, but measured and practical, focused on what could be managed rather than what couldn't. One evening in August, they sat on the porch watching a heat lightning storm play out over the distant hills, brilliant and beautiful and completely waterless, and she reached over and took his hand, and he said, without looking away from the light show, "We're going to be fine." "I know," she said. "I'm not saying it to convince you," he said. "I'm saying it because I believe it." "I know that too," she said. "That's why it works." He turned to look at her then, in the blue-white flash of the far lightning, and his face had on it the expression she had come to think of as the one reserved specifically for her, something open and full, the face of a man who was no longer keeping himself at careful distance from the things he felt. They were fine. The drought broke in September with 3 days of steady rain that turned the pastures green again and brought the river back to itself, and the fall calves came in strong, and by October they were looking at numbers that said this had been a good year after all. The first child came in April of 1880, and he was a boy. She labored for 14 hours in the room with the good light, with the midwife from town who had delivered approximately half the children in Carver's Creek, and Ruth, who had come up from San Antonio the moment the letter arrived saying it was time. Gilbert spent those 14 hours in a state of barely controlled terror that he manifested as purposeful activity, splitting more firewood than they needed for 3 winters, cleaning the barn, walking the fence line, having a long and somewhat unnecessary conversation with Tamaz about cattle grades. When the midwife called him in and he saw Edith in the bed, gray with exhaustion but with her eyes fully alive and fierce, holding a small and outraged person who was announcing his displeasure at the world with considerable volume, something in Gilbert's face broke open in a way she had never seen before. He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand and looked at the baby and then at her, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. When he did speak, his voice was not entirely steady. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she corrected. "You did more of it than I did," he said. "Significantly more." She was too tired to argue, so she let him have it. They named him James, Thomas Hadley James for Gilbert's father, Thomas for her father. Tom from the beginning, because Thomas felt formal on a small person who was fierce and loud and apparently determined to make his presence felt in every room. Young Tom was walking by the time the following winter came in, and talking in his own emphatic, idiosyncratic fashion. Shortly after that, and from very early, he had the combined qualities of both his parents in proportions that were sometimes alarming. He had Edith's brown eyes and her stubborn directness, and he had Gilbert's steady watchfulness, and he had something that was entirely his own, a cheerful boldness that made every day with him feel like an adventure. Ruth came to visit often, usually with Clara and the grandchildren, and those visits filled the house up in a way that Edith, who had spent years in a house that was quiet in the wrong way, found almost painful in its pleasure. She had not known she was lonely until she was not lonely anymore, and the knowledge of it sat in her chest warm and slightly stunned, like an animal that has been released from somewhere dark into the light. The second child, a girl, came in the winter of 1882. They named her Alina after Ruth, whose full name was Ruth Alina, and who cried when she heard it, which was the only time Edith had ever seen Ruth Hadley cry. Alina was dark-haired like her father and had Edith's wide, seeing eyes, and from her very earliest days she was a person of considerable opinions and the confidence to express them, which pleased Edith enormously. Tom was 3 when Alina arrived, and his assessment of her on first viewing was very loud and very small. He revised his opinion within the week when he discovered that Alina found him fascinating, and from that point they were allies, a state of affairs that would persist throughout their childhoods with only the normal interruptions of sibling conflict. In 1883, the cattle business went through a difficult contraction. Prices fell sharply as the railroads opened new routes, and the market was suddenly crowded with cattle from the northern ranges. Gilbert and Edith sat at the kitchen table many evenings that year with the ledgers between them, working through the numbers, cutting where they could cut, finding the places where efficiency was possible. There were ranches in the county that didn't survive that period, men who had overextended in the boom years and had no margin to absorb the fall. The rocking H survived because Gilbert had always been careful, and because Edith kept the books with ruthless clarity, and because they made decisions together rather than one of them simply telling the other what the situation was. It was during this period that she thought, sometimes, about the debt. About the $410 he had paid without telling her, and the fire she had felt on that morning ride, and the coffee he had poured, and the long, slow process of falling in love with a man she had come to inform that she was going to pay him back. She had paid him back. It had taken 18 months, the full $10 a month, every month without exception. On the day she had given him the last installment, he had made her a receipt that said, "Paid in full. All debts settled." Now and always, she had kept that receipt. It was in the small cedar box she kept on the dresser where she also kept her father's watch and her mother's ring. She took it out sometimes, not out of any particular sentiment, but because it marked the beginning of something, and the beginning of something good is worth remembering. Their third child was another boy born in 1885, strong and quiet from the very start, with Gilbert's amber-colored eyes and a calm manner that seemed to operate at a different frequency than his older siblings. They named him Robert, and he was the child who most clearly loved the land, following his father around the pastures from the time he could walk, watching the cattle with an attention that was not childlike at all, sitting in the shade of the live oak with a focused stillness that made you feel, looking at him, that the oak was the right companion for him. Carver's Creek changed around them as the years moved. The railroad came in 1886, which changed everything about the cattle economy and also brought new people, merchants, families, a doctor who set up a proper surgery, a schoolhouse that was finally funded well enough to pay a full-time teacher. The town grew in the way that small towns grow when the infrastructure catches up, becoming something more permanent and more complex than it had been. Edith, who had been teaching reading in an informal, underfunded way for years, was asked in 1887 to help establish the new school's curriculum, and she threw herself into this with an energy that surprised even Gilbert, who thought he knew the full range of her capabilities by that point. She worked with the school board, a collection of men who ranged from genuinely supportive to merely tolerant of a woman's opinion, with a patience that was tactical rather than passive, choosing her battles with the same careful pragmatism she brought to the ranch accounts. She won more often than she lost. The school that opened in the fall of 1887 in Carver's Creek was one of the better ones in the hill country, and she was proud of it in a way that was quiet and settled, not needing acknowledgement. Tom started at that school at 7, and Alina at 5, because Alina had simply refused to wait. Robert, at 2, was the appropriate age for waiting, and expressed his opinion of this through the specific dignified silence that was his particular form of protest. The fourth child, and the last, though they didn't know it then, came in the winter of 1888. A boy again, born in a snowstorm that was unusual for the Texas hill country and arrived quickly, in the way of fourth children who have done enough waiting, making his appearance into the world before the midwife could make it through the snow, and leaving Edith and Gilbert and Ruth, who had fortunately arrived 2 days earlier, to manage the birth among themselves. Gilbert delivered his own son with his sleeves rolled up and his hands steady and his face the color of whitewash, and the baby arrived squalling into the lantern light while the snow fell silently outside. They named him Arthur, for no particular historical reason except that it suited him, and he was the child who most resembled Edith: brown eyes, stubborn jaw, a directness of gaze that made people feel he was always about to ask them a pointed question. 4 children, a ranch, a school, a town that had grown up around them. The years accumulated the way good years do, not in dramatic events but in the texture of days that are full and real and shared. In 1890, Edith was 41 years old and Gilbert was 44. Tom was 10, Alina 8, Robert 5, and Arthur 2. Ruth Hadley was 70 and as sharp as she had ever been, making her annual visit from San Antonio with the energy of someone half her age, playing with grandchildren, reading on the front porch, correcting Gilbert's chess moves with the efficiency of a person who had never been willing to lose at chess merely out of sentiment. One evening that fall, when all 4 children were in bed and the house was quiet in the good way, the way that means people are sleeping safely nearby rather than absent, Edith and Gilbert sat on the porch in the cooling evening air, the live oak huge and dark above them, the windmill turning slowly in the breeze. The cattle were dim shapes in the far pasture. The first stars had come out. She thought about the morning she had ridden here with fire in her eyes, and she thought about how different this was from anything she had imagined when she had been 29 and angry and alone and struggling, and she thought that the distance between that morning and this evening was the whole complicated, unexpected story of her life. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said. "Did you know," she said, "when you bought that debt, did you know it would lead to all this?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was when he was thinking something through honestly rather than reaching for an easy answer. "No," he said. "I didn't. I didn't plan any of it, Edith. I knew your name from what I'd heard. I knew the shape of what had happened to you. And I walked past the lending house one morning and thought about it, and then I walked in." He paused. "I told myself it was just a practical thing, that I was helping a neighbor, but the truth is," he stopped, started again. "The truth is there was something else in it, something I couldn't entirely name. I just thought that ought not to happen to her. This woman I've never spoken to ought not to have to carry this." She looked at him in the starlight. "You fell in love with a woman you'd never met," she said. "I don't think I'd call it that," he said, but he was smiling. "I think I was just paying attention, the way you pay attention to something that matters before you know it matters. That might be what falling in love is," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way she had taken his on that December porch so long ago. "Then yes," he said, "I suppose it might have been that." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat watching the stars come out one by one over the Texas hill country, and the windmill turned, and the cattle moved in the dark pasture, and inside the house their 4 children slept the deep sleep of children who feel safe, and Edith thought, this is what it was all leading to, not in a neat or intended way. In the way things actually happened sideways and surprising and complicated, and arriving at something better than what you could have planned. The years that followed were generous. Tom grew into a tall, serious young man who had his mother's head for business and his father's feel for land, and who took over much of the management of the Rocking H in his 20s with a quiet competence that was entirely his own. At 25, he married a young schoolteacher named Amelia who had come west from Missouri, and they were well matched in the way that takes people a while to see and then becomes obvious. Eleanor, at 20, went east to study at a college for women in Tennessee, which caused considerable comment in Carver's Creek and considerable pride in the Rocking H. She came back 3 years later with a teaching certificate and the intention to establish a proper school in the county that would educate children regardless of whether their families could pay. And she proceeded to do exactly that with the particular focused determination of a woman who had been watching her mother do exactly that kind of thing her whole life. Robert, who had loved the land since he was old enough to follow his father around the pastures, became the rancher of the family in the fullest sense, eventually running his own spread on land adjacent to the Rocking H, building it with the same patient attention he had applied to everything since childhood. He married a rancher's daughter named Catalina, whose family had been in the hill country since before Texas was Texas, and who understood the land with the same bone-deep fluency that Robert did. Arthur was the surprise. He became a lawyer, studying in Austin, returning to the hill country to practice in Carver's Creek, and becoming one of those men who quietly uses the law as a tool for making things more fair for the people who need fairness most. He argued several cases on behalf of small landowners in water rights disputes, and Edith watched him in the courtroom once and saw something of herself in the careful, relentless way he built his case, and felt a pride that was almost embarrassing in its intensity. In 1905, Ruth Hadley died in San Antonio at 85, still sharp, still reading, still losing at chess deliberately to let the grandchildren feel they had earned a victory. Clara wrote to them immediately, and they traveled to San Antonio for the funeral, the whole family, all 4 children and their spouses and the 7 grandchildren who had arrived by then. Gilbert was 59 and Edith was 55. And they stood at the graveside holding hands, and when it was over he said, quietly, that she had liked Edith more than she had liked almost anyone, and Edith said she already knew that, and that the feeling had been entirely mutual. Ruth had left Edith her collection of books, which was considerable, several shelves of novels and poetry and history that arrived in a wagon from San Antonio 2 weeks after the funeral. Edith placed them throughout the house, in the spaces between her own books, and the mixing of the 2 libraries felt right. The ranch continued to grow, to change, to be shaped by its people and its seasons. New fencing went up when the old posts rotted out. The barn was rebuilt in 1908 after a lightning fire destroyed the original. The house was expanded in 1910, a new parlor on the east side, 2 more bedrooms above, to accommodate the increasing frequency of family gatherings that the expanding family required. Edith supervised the construction with the same precision she brought to the accounts, and Gilbert spent most of the construction period following her directives with the ease of a man who had long since made peace with the fact that his wife was better at certain things than he was. He was not diminished by this. He was made larger by it, she thought, by having someone beside him who was fully herself, fully capable, fully there. That was what a partnership did. It made you more of what you were, not less. In 1912, Tom and Amelia's oldest boy, their grandson James, named for the same great-grandfather as his father had been named, turned 12, and Edith began teaching him mathematics in the evenings the way her father had once taught her. Young James had a particular gift for numbers, and sitting with him at the kitchen table while he worked through problems, she felt her father's presence very clearly, not as something sad, but as something continuous, a thread connecting generations. Gilbert watched her with the boy sometimes, standing in the kitchen doorway the way he had always stood in doorways, with that quality of patient, warm attention that she had first noticed and then come to love and then come to rely upon as one of the fixed points of her world. "You look like you're exactly where you're supposed to be," he said one evening when young James had gone home. She looked up at him. "I am," she said, simply, because it was simply true. They were older now. She was 63, he was 66, and being older felt different than she had expected it to feel. It felt like the world had become both smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because the body made its negotiations, and the distances she had once covered without thought now required planning. Larger because the things that mattered were so clearly and undeniably apparent that everything else had receded, and what remained was very bright. She still rode, though not as far as she once had. She still kept the accounts, though Tom had taken on more of the operational decisions. She still helped with the school, Eleanor's school, which had grown by now into a real county institution with 2 teachers and 73 students, not in an official capacity, but in the way that a person who helped build something keeps helping, because it is theirs in some important sense. Gilbert was slower too, though he worked at the pace of a man who has learned to be efficient rather than merely fast. He still rose before dawn. He still knew every animal on the place by character, a habit from younger years that had become so ingrained it was just how he understood the land. He and Tamaz, old Tamaz, who had been with him for nearly 40 years and moved more slowly now, but was as sure and steady as ever, could still be found on most mornings in the near pasture, moving through the cattle with the comfortable efficiency of men who have been doing something together so long that communication is mostly unnecessary. In the spring of 1918, Edith turned 69 and Gilbert turned 72, and they sat on the porch of the rocking H on a May evening that was so like the spring evenings of 40 years ago that she found herself slightly disoriented by it. The same light, the same smell of cedar and warm grass, the same windmill turning, the same live oak, vast now above the house, its trunk 3 times the circumference it had been when she first tied Josephine to the porch railing in 1878. The world had changed enormously outside the ranch. The Great War in Europe was grinding into its 4th year. Arthur had 2 sons of fighting age, and the worry about them was constant and heavy. The automobile had arrived even in Carver's Creek, and Eleanor drove one with the confident enjoyment of someone who had always welcomed new tools. The railroad had changed the cattle business past recognition. The world of 1878, the world of $500 debts in red ink and 12-mile rides across the hill country, felt like a different era, because it was. But there was something continuous in the world as well, and Edith felt it most clearly on evenings like this, with the familiar weight of this porch and this light and this man beside her. 40 years, she said. Nearly, he agreed. The anniversary is in April. 40 years since I rode down that road with the intention of giving you a piece of my mind. You did give me a piece of your mind, he said. A very specific piece, very clearly expressed. And you were infuriatingly reasonable about it, she said. I was terrified, he said. You came in on that bay mare with your chin up and your eyes, you had fire in your eyes, Edith. I thought to myself, this woman is going to say exactly what she thinks of me, and she is going to be completely right. I was, she said. You were, he agreed. And then you stayed for coffee. And then I stayed for 40 years, she said. He took her hand. His hands were older now, the skin thinner, the knuckles more prominent, but they were still his hands, still the same quality of warm and sure that she had first noticed on a December porch when she had reached out and taken them. Are you sorry? He asked, not with any real uncertainty, in the way you ask a question when you already know the answer but find the hearing of it worthwhile. Not for a single day, she said. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips against it, not a performative gesture but a real one, private and certain. The live oak moved overhead in the evening wind. From inside the house came the sound of young James practicing on the piano that Amelia had brought with her when she married Tom, a competent, cheerful rendition of something simple that floated out the open windows into the warm air. Edith looked out at the land, the home pasture, the distant hills, the cypress corridor she knew ran along the river 2 miles south, the big sky that was going amber and rose above the tree line. She thought about her father's stone house and the thin edge of grief that had been her only companion for too long, and she thought about the ledger with the red ink and Dillard's pale, careful face, and she thought about the morning she had saddled Josephine and ridden south with enough fury to set the prairie on fire. She had come here angry and she had stayed for love, and the love had been a real one. Not the easy, frictionless variety, not a love that asked nothing of either of them, but the kind that required being seen and known and chosen, over and over, across the full, complicated length of a life. The kind that made room for all of it, for grief and work and difficult years and wonderful ones, for the children they had made and the people those children had become, for laughter in the kitchen and arguments on the porch and 40 years of Friday afternoons and then every day after that. The music from inside the house continued. The live oak held the last of the evening light in its massive canopy. Gilbert, she said. He said. I'm glad you bought that debt, she said. He turned to look at her and she looked back, and they were old, both of them, and the beauty of it was extraordinary. So am I, he said. The evening settled around the rocking H, over the home pasture and the good cedar fence and the red barn that had been rebuilt, and the windmill that had been turning for 40 years, over the live oak that had been there longer than any of them, over the graves in the small plot on the east hill where the cedar was thickest. Josephine, eventually, and Tamaz, who had outlasted everyone's expectations and finally gone quietly in the winter of 1916 at a very old age, attended by the whole ranch. The evening settled over the house with its 4 children's bedrooms and Ruth's books mixed with Edith's books on every shelf, over the cedar box on the dresser with the paid-in-full receipt inside it. It settled over 2 people on a porch who had found each other through the unlikely door of a debt and a fury and a cup of coffee, and had built something from those unlikely materials that was, by any measure, very fine indeed. The sun finished setting. The first stars appeared, those same stars that had been appearing over the Texas hill country for all of their years together, punctual and impervious and brilliantly present. Young James finished his piano piece inside, and after a moment of silence began it again, more confidently this time. Edith leaned her head on Gilbert's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the gathering dark on the porch of the rocking H while the windmill turned and the cattle settled for the night and the stars increased above them. And it was exactly right, and it was enough, and it was everything. In the years that followed, Arthur's sons came home safely from Europe, not unscathed, because war never sends anyone home unscathed, but alive and whole enough to build their lives, which felt like the most important thing. Alina expanded the school twice more and lived to see it funded by the county officially, a victory she celebrated with characteristic understatement, and then moved on to the next thing. Robert's ranch prospered and Catalina filled their house with a garden that became locally famous, and their children grew up bilingual and confident and deeply rooted in the hill country in a way that made Edith think about continuity, about what it meant to love a piece of land for generations. Tom and Amelia had 4 children in total, and one of them, their daughter Frances, who had her grandmother Edith's brown eyes and fierce directness, showed every sign of being the next person in the family to startle everyone with her capabilities. She was 16 in 1918, and already running mathematical calculations in her head faster than anyone else in the household, and Edith watched her with the particular delight of someone who recognizes a familiar intelligence. "That one," Edith told Gilbert one evening, watching Frances help her brother with his figures, "is going to do something people tell her she cannot do, and she is going to do it anyway." "I've seen that before," Gilbert said, "in another young woman I know." "I was not that young," she said. 29 is young," he said, "from this vantage point considerably." She laughed, and it was the same laugh as the one in the spring pasture all those decades ago, the window-opening kind, the kind that meant something good had reached her, and he looked at her when she laughed in the same way he always had, with that unguarded warmth that had been there since the first real smile he had ever given her, on a fence line between his south pasture and the river. They were good years, the ones that continued. Not easy, because no years were easy, but good in the way that things are good when they are built on solid foundations by people who have chosen each other honestly and kept on choosing. The Rocking H entered its 5th decade under their joint stewardship, and entered it well, the land in good condition, the cattle strong, the accounts clear, the fencing sound, the barn solid, the house full of books and grandchildren, and the reliable daily weather of 2 people who knew each other down to the bone. Edith Gentry, Edith Hadley, though she was still called Gentry by enough people in town that she had long since stopped correcting it, lived on the Rocking H for 40 years, and then some, in the house that had once seemed like a destination she had arrived at in anger and had gradually understood was the place she had been riding toward her whole life without knowing it. She died in the spring, which was right, with the cedar flowering on the hillsides and the cattle making their sound in the home pasture, and the live oak filling the window with new green leaves. Gilbert outlived her by 2 years, which he spent in the way he had spent the previous 40 rising before dawn, walking the land, keeping the accounts she had taught him to keep in her particular meticulous way, reading every evening in the chair by the window that had been her father's chair and then hers, and had become the place in the house where the light was best, and where a person could feel the most present, sitting quietly in a life well built. He told the story of the debt sometimes, to grandchildren who asked. He told it simply and without embellishment, that he had heard of a woman doing something remarkable, and that he had wanted to make it easier, and that she had ridden to his door with fire in her eyes and stayed for 40 years, and that those 40 years had been the best and most significant thing in his life, and that if he had known on the morning he walked into the lending house what was coming, he would have walked faster. The children who heard this story told it to their own children, and they to theirs, and the Rocking H passed through the Hadley family as good land does, not unchanged, because land is never unchanged by the people who love it, but continuous, carrying in its pastures and its cedar and its living water the long memory of everything that had been built there. The first fence posts, and the rebuilt barn and the live oak and the careful records in Edith's hand in the ledger books that were kept, all of them. In the cabinet in the front room, evidence of a life in which nothing had been wasted, not the grief, not the debt, not the anger, not a single one of the Friday afternoons that had become the rest of everything.